Welcome. Welcome to the Eden Valley in autumn and to a Viognier vineyard in the Eden Valley. This is a vineyard that goes into the Yalumba Eden Valley Viognier. And autumn's the great time for Viognier. It's when it ripens, it's when it starts to look just like you can see here, and we're only a few days away from picking this and starting to turn it into wine. The Eden Valley is our place for Viognier. It's where the Eden Valley Viognier comes from, obviously, but also where the Viognier comes from. And it's where we first planted Viognier in 1980 and where we've got the most experience. So for our Eden Valley and for the Viogniers, the fruit always comes from vineyards just like this one, within walking distance of where we are now. The Y series comes from a number of regions where we planted vineyards subsequent to our work in the Eden Valley, and from things that we learnt while we were growing Viognier here. So now we grow vineyard in the Riverland, not far from the Oxford Landing vineyard. We grow Viognier in Rattonbully, and then we have growers in the Barossa Valley and in the Adelaide Hills. And it's those different regions, quite different climates, quite different soils that give you the layers, if you like, the differences of flavours that you find in the Y series. Viognier is not a difficult variety, but it's different. It's different from how Riesling grows. In fact, it's different to how most of the other white varieties that we're used to making or to growing grows. So once you understand what makes Viognier Viognier and appreciate that for its differences, then it's actually really easy to understand. So it's not a difficult variety. That's being very unfair on it. But what you see here is very typical of Viognier. And if this was a Riesling vineyard and it looked like this, we'd be a bit worried, because you can see that the grapes have got a bit of a suntan on them, and if they were Riesling, you'd say, oh good heavens, they've been sunburnt, but they're not. They're just sitting out in the sun. Viognier loves being in the sun. They're the grapes that got the flavour in them. If you had to hide your way in here and find grapes on the inside of the canopy, they wouldn't have any flavour because they wouldn't have been exposed to the sun. If it was a Sauvignon Blanc vineyard, that's where you'd want your fruit in there, because you want them in the shade. You want those lovely sort of cool flavours that Sauvignon Blanc has, or Riesling, for example. So, it's different from that point of view. So as grape growers, we needed to understand that Viognier likes being out here, and it gets, it actually goes past being, ripe where perhaps another variety would be. And that's where all of a sudden, almost overnight, you go from grapes that don't taste like much to actually having this amazing sort of apricot flavours. Depending on the season, Viognier we would be picking it here in the Eden Valley in March, sometimes even as late as April. Strangely, or probably not strangely, in fact, our vintage tends to follow Easter. So early Easter, early vintage, which is what we're happening this year. If you have a very late vintage, then typically we might be picking this into April. But these vines are within a week of being picked. Even before you start tasting the grapes, you can usually see a vineyard when it's ready to pick with Viognier. If you look at these leaves, they're starting to look a bit more autumnal than really green and fresh. So once the vines start looking like they're starting to think about going into autumn, that's typically when the flavours start popping out in the grapes. So it's it's not just what you taste; it's actually what you sort of feel and everything else that's going on around here. So once we've picked the grapes, they're transported into the winery, which is usually only a few minutes away. All we want to do is take the skins and the seeds out of the grapes, basically, and liberate the juice. So we do that by squashing them gently. The juice runs through the air, and it passively reacts with the air, and it goes really brown, which is a bit unnerving for people when they've never seen it before, because they're not quite sure how you're going to make a white wine out of this really muddy-looking, cloudy brown juice. But the reality is that juice has got all of the beautiful ingredients that are going to make the wine, including those yeasts and those bacteria that have come in. So those yeasts start to ferment, they start to react, they start to turn the sugar into alcohol. And all the different species of yeasts that are in there, and the types of yeast, all have slightly different characteristics that they impart to the wine. So that's where you're building up the textures and the flavours of the wine, not just from the juice. So if there was only one yeast in there, if we'd added a packet of yeast and it was just the one strain and there were millions of exactly the same yeast, you'd get a very linear flavoured wine. But because you've got this real breadth of and this diversity of yeast that are in there, they're all going to act a little bit differently. So you get this wonderful sort of cacophony of different flavours and characters that come out of that fermentation. So the Y series Viognier might spend 2 or 3 months on the yeast lees in the tank before we blend it up and start to bottle it and start to sell it. For the Eden Valley Viognier and the Viognier, it would stay in those barrels for 9 or 10 months before we blend it. And at that point we do it barrel by barrel, and that's where we're choosing, you know, we taste the wine from each barrel and we decide whether or not it's, you know, it's of an Eden Valley, you know, style, or whether it might be a Viognier style. The Viognier normally comes from that first vineyard that we planted in 1980, but it is actually only the best barrels that come from there that go into that. So it's not every grape makes it into the Viognier. And everything that's more fruit driven and open, you know, goes into the Eden Valley Viognier. So with varieties like Riesling in the Eden Valley, the Riesling's grown here for 160 years. You know, it was the first variety planted in 1847 in the Eden Valley, and, you know, we've been making it all that time as winemakers. And so we think we've got a bit of a handle on varieties like Riesling. You know, if you compare that sort of history and how long you've been doing something with a variety like Riesling to Viognier that was first planted in 1980, and we've really only been making it, you know, in any way that's similar to now since sort of the mid-90s, it's not surprising that in fact, you know, we're actually on this Viognier journey, and we often talk about our Viognier journey. When something's new and exciting and everyone talks about this new kid on the block, you see a really rapid rise in sales. And we did that when we really first started to focus on Viognier. The key, of course, is, you know, that the making it's the easy bit, and the selling it is something that you've got to, you know, got to keep doing. And when everyone's really focused on something and it's new and exciting and the press are all talking about it, you know, everyone wants to try it, and that's great. The hard thing, of course, is then keeping the momentum up when other new kids come along. And of course, the other things that came along in the intervening time were Pinot Grigio, Pinot Gris, and Sauvignon Blanc. And what happened was that the Viognier sales for us stopped growing at that incredible rate that they were. And to be honest, if they'd kept growing at that incredible rate they were, it would have been the next Chardonnay. And we've never wanted it to be the biggest single, you know, what variety, because of course once something's really fashionable, then the next thing it is going to be out of fashion. And I think we've Viognier escaped that sort of, well, it was the next big thing, fashion sort of side of it. But what we need to do is to make sure that it stays front of mind as an option for particular occasions. And of course the most important occasions for us as far as Viognier is concerned are as food.